Good morning. The U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging will now come to order. Today, we're here to ask a simple but important question. Is the FDA doing everything Congress intended it to do to quickly get safe, effective treatments to patients with rare diseases who cannot afford to wait? For more than 30 million Americans living with a rare disease, making sacrifices every day is just a part of life. But something they cannot afford to give up is time. Time means the ability to walk. Time means independence. Time means being able to speak, eat, or even recognize a loved one. And too often, time is exactly what patients lose while therapies sit in regulatory limbo. Growing up, I saw firsthand how a rare disease can affect a family. My family didn't have health insurance, and my brother had a rare hip disease. My mom had to drive 200 miles round trip just so he could get the care he needed. She made that sacrifice because care couldn't wait. My brother couldn't afford to sacrifice time. Congress has been clear. On an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis, we have given the FDA flexibility to move faster for patients with serious and life-threatening conditions. In 2016, Congress passed the 21st Century Cures Act. In that bill and other bills that followed, Congress gave direction to the FDA, encouraged the use of real-world evidence, highlighting that rare disease drug development requires adaptability and urgency. These laws were meant to help cut through bureaucratic delays and give patients access to the care and cures they so desperately need. But here we are, 10 years later, hearing from patients, physicians, and drug developers that the system is not working as Congress intended. I've heard from Commissioner Makary that he is working hard to fix long-standing problems at the FDA. And I want to thank him for the work he's doing to try and make a strained system work better for patients. However, advocates here today will describe inconsistent review practices, shifting standards, and redundant, often late-appearing data requests that in many cases may not be driven by safety concerns, but by an overly cautious and rigid approach that puts bureaucratic processes ahead of patients. As we will hear, the human cost of this regulatory slow walking is real. Many of the patients affected by these delays have no other treatment options. Patients from every state come and talk to our offices, and I'm sure the same thing with the ranking member, sharing their irreversible declines in health that happen while they or someone they care about waits for a treatment that might never come. It's heartbreaking to hear from families who are left watching their loved ones deteriorate, while promising therapies remain stuck in review. Meanwhile, small biotech companies struggle to survive years of uncertainty even when their science is sound. Beyond individual patients, there are serious national security consequences that come with the FDA's inaction and delays. Our adversaries have been accelerating their drug development and approval, attracting investment, talent, and clinical trials. FDA inaction here at home creates an economic and national competitive issue. Let me be clear. This hearing is not about weakening safety standards. Safety must always come first. But safety and speed are not mutually exclusive. A system can protect patients while still acting with urgency, transparency, and common sense. Some of you may be asking why the Senate Aging Committee is tackling this issue when so many of those impacted by issues with rare disease treatments are young. Here's why. Part of caring for America's aging population is making sure that more Americans are given the opportunity to grow old. It may sound cliche, but we are all aging. And if something is standing in the way of a younger American making it to their senior years, that is absolutely the business of this committee and something we need to try and fix. It is my hope that today's hearing will serve as a useful tool to help us understand what we can do to bring accountability, transparency, and efficiency to the process. We are joined by an incredible panel of witnesses here today representing a wide range of perspectives, but all working toward a better future for people living with rare diseases. Now, we have a lot of members in the crowd that are here because rare disease drugs are very important to them, and I want to thank everybody for being here. Now I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Gillibrand for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. I really appreciate you calling today's hearing. And thank you for our witnesses and the advocates who are here for Rare Disease Day on the Hill. It makes a big difference that you come together to make sure your loved ones are being heard and that the challenges and struggles that you go through as families and supporters are being understood by lawmakers. Every one of us in this room today knows that when we have a friend or a loved one or a family member who has a rare disease, that the most important thing is finding a cure, getting the treatment, and making sure they survive. A disease is considered rare if it affects fewer than 200,000 people, but rare diseases actually aren't that rare. 1 in 10 Americans is living with a rare disease. And as you know, many of these patients face substantial unmet medical needs. Because it can be really difficult and expensive for companies to develop these treatments and the FDA to evaluate them, Congress has provided the agency with significant regulatory flexibility to encourage both biotech innovation and rare disease therapies. These include the authorizing the accelerated approval pathway to speed up the drug review, establishing programs like the Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Pilot to bolster novel endpoint development, and strengthening and expanding the use of patient experience data and real-world evidence in drug reviews. These mechanisms are designed to help improve access to novel treatments for our patients, and they're supposed to provide drug sponsors with a predictable and consistent approach to addressing regulatory science challenges that are unique in rare disease therapy development and review, like designing complex clinical trials, developing appropriate endpoints, and using real-world evidence. But it's not working how it should be. FDA's approach, transparency, and flexibility varies widely between its offices, divisions, and centers. We've seen a pattern of hesitation to use authorized flexibilities, limited communication with drug sponsors, failure to incorporate patient experience and real-world evidence reviews, and FDA shifting its regulatory position on trial design at the last minute, rejecting drug applications, and requiring new clinical trials the sponsor may be unable to perform. This is heartbreaking for patients, and it's why we can't afford delays and disruptions in treatment. Rare diseases can progress rapidly, cause irreversible harm, and in some cases, premature death. This is also frustrating for drug sponsors who face increased costs and delayed timelines that impact the viability of their clinical trials, particularly in the United States. Uncertainty shapes behavior across the biotech ecosystem. Without consistency and predictability, drug sponsors will continue to struggle with seeking FDA approval and will take their clinical trials elsewhere, like to China. This is bad for business and it's bad for patients. If we want the U.S. to remain the global leader in biotech, and we want American patients to have access to these novel treatments, things need to change. Congress must hold the FDA accountable. We must make sure FDA fixes its inconsistent and unpredictable application of regulatory flexibility. It's essential for supporting innovation while upholding the highest standard for safety and efficacy in the approval of these rare disease drugs. And FDA appears to be moving in the right direction. With the Rare Disease Evidence Principles, the Rare Disease Innovation Hub proposing new pathways for approval and trying to hire more reviewers. But it doesn't matter what agency leadership puts in a press release. It's about execution and implementation across all levels of that agency. Consistency from top to bottom. And Congress will ensure that happens by conducting oversight, encouraging application of authorized flexibilities, and providing adequate resources to restore agency capacity. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and working with this committee to hold the FDA accountable because rare disease patients cannot wait.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I'd like to welcome our witnesses, experts who are here to talk about how serious this issue is and the steps we can take to ensure patients with rare diseases are not left behind by regulatory delay. First, I'd like to recognize Annie Kennedy, Chief Mission Officer at the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. Ms. Kennedy is a nationally recognized leader in rare disease policy and patient advocacy and works directly with patients, caregivers, and families navigating the drug development and approval process. Every life represents the voices of rare disease communities across the country and has long advocated for patient-centered policies, regulatory flexibility, and timely access to life-saving therapies. Thank you for being here, and please begin your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gillibrand, and distinguished members of the committee for convening this critical hearing. I am Annie Kennedy, Chief Mission Officer for the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. I'm honored to be here alongside the hundreds of advocates who've joined us for Rare Disease Week on Capitol Hill. Collectively, we are representing the more than 30 million Americans living with rare diseases. Today, there are more than 10,000 known rare diseases, about 70% of which start in childhood. For small patient communities facing progressive diseases, time is a commodity. Traditional large placebo-controlled trials are often neither feasible nor ethical when considering the challenges and urgency of rare disease. Beginning with the passage of the Orphan Drug Act in 1983, your leadership has provided tools that have rocketed the U.S. into the most competitive developer of rare disease products. Each landmark law since has reshaped our landscape. In fact, tomorrow marks an anniversary of another watershed moment for our community here on Capitol Hill. The MD CARE Act hearing, convened in this exact same hearing room, presided over by Senator Arlen Specter, included a 13-year-old named Benjamin Cumbo. 25 years ago, I watched with great pride as Ben asked Congress for actions that could help cure him and his friends so that he could achieve his dreams of growing up, having a girlfriend, and serving his country. And Congress did respond. In that time, Congress has built a framework that incentivizes rare product development, authorizes regulatory flexibility, creates new pathways to approval, and embeds patient experience into review. While fewer than 5% of rare diseases currently have an FDA-approved treatment, nearly 1,400 orphan-designated therapies are now changing the lives of patients and families. But recently, this momentum has shifted. We are here today because our community has experienced worrisome trends with devastating consequences. While we are heartened by recent announcements of therapy development initiatives such as the Rare Disease and Evidence Principles Framework and the Plausible Mechanism Pathway, and are eager to work with the agency on their implementation, our rare disease community has experienced a series of product application actions that seem misaligned with these recent public pledges to expand the use of regulatory flexibility. Since the start of 2025, we have seen at least 23 complete response letters declining to approve rare disease therapies, many under accelerated approval, that suggest a hesitation to apply regulatory flexibility through surrogate endpoints, natural history studies, and external controls. At that same time, advisory committee meetings for drugs and biologics declined by 65% compared to 2024, reducing opportunities for external expertise and patient insights to inform complex rare disease product decisions. We asked families who'd been personally affected by recent regulatory decisions to reflect on their impact. These stories will be shared for the record. Story after story spoke to chilling consequences of recent regulatory delays and clinical trial hurdles. As one mom shared about her son, Stone, "My son is now receiving this experimental treatment, and he is thriving. For the first time since his diagnosis, his doctors have told us with this treatment, a near normal lifespan is within reach. For a disease that once came with a teenage expiration date that is nothing short of extraordinary. But we are now living in fear, not because science failed, not because companies stopped fighting rare disease, but because of regulatory inconsistency. We are here today because congressional action is needed to ensure that this generation of patients will benefit from our existing rare disease treatment pipelines. We ask that Congress engage FDA to clarify its approach to accelerated approval for our diseases, its consistent application of regulatory flexibility, and to urge the resumption of advisory committee meetings so that external expertise informs complex reviews. We also urge Congress to resource the Rare Disease Innovation Hub to strengthen cross-center coordination and to establish the Rare Disease and Condition Advisory Committee and a science-focused drug development initiative. In closing, 25 years ago, I stood in this room filled with rare families. Today, advances in science have put life-altering treatments within reach for many, but those advances were not in time for those who were in this room with me 25 years ago. While Ben achieved many of his dreams, he died 2 days before receiving his master's degree. We now have the opportunity to ensure that this generation of rare disease patients will benefit from today's therapy development pipelines. Each time a promising therapy faces delays or demise, investment wanes, future scientific promise is unfulfilled, and lives are lost. Time is the most precious commodity for a rare disease community, and as Stone's mom implored while writing from his hospital bedside, we are closer than ever to rewriting the future of these diseases. Please don't let my generation become the next group of mothers who stand at gravesides instead of graduations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeremy Schwalman, Professor of Neurology at Harvard Medical School, Founding Director of the Ataxia Center at Massachusetts General Hospital, and Principal Investigator for the Laboratory for Neoanonymity. Say about right? And he is a leading neurologist who treats patients with progressive and neurodegenerative diseases where time and access to treatment are critical. He has seen firsthand the consequences of delayed access to care and the irreversible loss patients can experience while waiting for regulatory decisions. His testimony will ground today's discussion in the real-world clinical impact these regulatory delays have on patients and families. Thank you for being here. Please begin your testimony.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gillibrand, members of the committee, thank you for convening this hearing and for the opportunity to testify and for your remarkable opening statements. My name is Jeremy Schwalman. I am the Martha and Robert Fogelman Chair in Ataxia and Cerebellar Neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital and Professor of Neurology at Harvard Medical School. I started the first ataxia center in the country, and I've cared for patients with spinocerebellar ataxia for 45 years, and the site principal investigator for Biohaven's study of troriluzole in ataxia. And my comments today reflect my personal and professional opinion, not necessarily that of my employer. Senators, please help us fix the FDA. It has rejected troriluzole, a drug that is safe, the first treatment to improve quality of life and slow progression in spinocerebellar ataxia. My patient Steve, for example, developed spinocerebellar ataxia type 3, also known as Machado-Joseph disease, in his late 30s. Like his mother before him, he will become increasingly disabled, will need to use a wheelchair, become bedridden, and die young. But since starting troriluzole a year ago, he has not changed. Mary, in her late 40s, has type 2. After 6.5 years on troriluzole, she has not changed. These inherited neurodegenerative diseases worsen inexorably, and in this business, staying the same is success. Like other rare diseases, ataxia is difficult to study, deteriorates slowly, and manifests differently even within families. There are 15,000 ataxia patients in America. Some affect hundreds of people, some just a few. Now, Congress, as you've told us, recognized these challenges and passed legislation mandating that FDA use regulatory flexibility and real-world evidence in rare diseases like ataxia. The drug riluzole, used to treat ALS for 30 years, was reported to improve ataxia. Based on this and a plausible mechanism of action in spinocerebellar ataxia, Biohaven developed troriluzole, which metabolizes into riluzole but is taken once a day with better brain penetration and fewer side effects. Early in the drug's development, ataxia patients who stopped treatment after a year of open-label therapy insisted they go back on troriluzole because they told us their condition worsened after stopping the drug. So Biohaven, to their credit, provided troriluzole to these patients and ran a 1-year double-blind placebo-controlled study. Patients with spinocerebellar ataxia type 3 improved compared to placebo. They were falling less and they had fewer injuries. So Biohaven requested approval of troriluzole for spinocerebellar ataxia type 3 based on these results. The FDA refused to review the new drug application. So Biohaven obtained FDA feedback and used a revised protocol to follow patients on drug for another 3 years, comparing them with patients in 2 natural history studies. In this real-world evidence study, troriluzole showed significant improvement across 9 pre-specified FDA endpoints, slowing disease by 50 to 70%. This is a dramatic result that was supported by patient and physician feedback. We were all shocked when FDA denied approval of this safe drug that makes people better. I wrote 6 letters to FDA leadership between 2023 and 2025, co-signed by 17 ataxia colleagues, asking FDA to review the application again and work with Biohaven to make the drug available, if necessary, performing post-marketing studies. I never heard back. Now, 300 patients stable on troriluzole will have to come off drug, and they are distraught. I met 3 times with FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. On each occasion, they did not heed the patients or the experts or consider the science. One panel member said to me, "Why should I listen to you?" The FDA's proposed path forward is another placebo-controlled trial that will take 5 to 8 years, or a randomized withdrawal of drug from patients benefiting from it. If this happens, patients on placebo will die. I believe this to be unethical, lacking charity, mercy, or kindness. Senators, please, save our patients' lives. Use your authority to require that FDA consider real-world evidence and applies the regulatory flexibility you have legislated, and in so doing, restore transparency, integrity, and competence to the agency. Thank you.
Now I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Gillibrand to introduce our next witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to introduce our next witness, Bradley Campbell. Mr. Campbell is the president and CEO of Amicus Therapeutics, a biotechnology company focused on discovering and developing new medicines for people living with rare diseases. During his tenure at Amicus, he led the global commercialization of Galafold, a medication used to treat Fabry disease in adults, which was approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration on an accelerated basis. Mr. Campbell brings over 20 years of experience in the rare and orphan disease fields. You may begin your testimony.
Thank you very much, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gillibrand, the rest of the senators on the committee. It's my privilege to be here today to speak to you about our experience in developing drugs for people living with rare diseases. I'm also honored to be here alongside my fellow panelists. I feel far less qualified than they to speak today, but I hope I can share some perspectives on the challenges and opportunities we have to help fix the system. I have had the privilege to work at Amicus for the last 20 years and have dedicated most of my professional career to developing new treatments for people living with rare disease. And I thought I could begin with a patient story that I think captures the spirit of the testimony here today and the conversation we're having. At a recent patient meeting, we were discussing patient experience data and how we might make endpoints for clinical trials more meaningful for patients. And during a break, a young woman with Pompe disease took me aside and said, what would be most meaningful for her is if she could breathe on her own for just 1 minute. That would make the difference between her life and her death. This is not an approvable endpoint in Pompe disease, of course, but she depends upon a mechanical ventilator to breathe. If that ventilator fails, if the battery dies, if an aid fails to clear a mucus plug, just that 60 seconds of her own breath could make the difference between her life and her death. I think that comment is a very powerful reminder to why patients and caregivers must help us design better clinical studies with real endpoints that make a difference for them. We can't ask patients to wait for years before approved treatments come when the difference between life and death can be that single breath. I think the rare disease innovation ecosystem in the United States has made enormous progress over the last 20 years, but it must now again adapt in speed, agility, and flexibility to keep the pace of innovation. One of our own development experiences at Amicus, I think, sheds light on how regulatory flexibility and working together with sponsors and regulators can make a real difference in drug development. When we were developing our medicine Galafold for Fabry disease, we learned in early studies that in some patients the drug worked and some patients it didn't. Through careful data analysis and close collaboration with the FDA and regulators around the world, we developed an assay that could identify which of the thousands of genetic variants that cause Fabry disease might best respond to the therapy, and just as importantly, which ones may not. The FDA ultimately incorporated that assay into our label and approved the first ever oral precision medicine for people living with Fabry disease. So what does that mean? That means when sponsors and regulators work together, the result was an oral treatment option that has saved thousands of patients years of biweekly infusions. We know rare diseases are biologically complex. We know they're difficult to study. As we sit here today, 95% of the more than 10,000 known rare diseases lack an FDA-approved treatment. I think that's statistics many of us are familiar with. But if you fast forward that pace of development, it will take us 150 years to only treat half of the remaining rare diseases. Small and mid-sized biotechnology companies like Amicus, Biohaven, and others are the engine of rare disease innovation. But they can only succeed if the regulatory system adapts along with unmet medical need. I think there are three practical areas that we can work together to improve that very system. First, we must start clinical trials faster. We know in other countries, those trials start in weeks, not months. We can reduce administrative requirements, leverage single IRBs, use AI and other digital tools to get into the clinic faster. We also must find better ways to measure efficacy. We can use biomarkers, innovative endpoints, accelerated approvals. These are things the FDA has at its disposal right now, but we must use them more. And we can make manufacturing inspections and rules work better. The single biggest delay oftentimes is inspections from getting patients access to medicines. The FDA has tools like remote interactive inspections and relying on global regulators to reduce that inefficiency. And let me close with just one final story. At a patient meeting last year, a man with Fabry disease told us when he was diagnosed in his 30s, he stopped saving for retirement because he thought there was no reason to think he could live that long. Fast forward 15 years, Fabry disease is now a treatable disease. Advancement in treatments have changed that trajectory, and for the first time, he's thinking about a future he thought he would never have. I look forward to working together with the members of this committee and indeed with the regulators, the broad community here focused on rare diseases to find ways to ensure that we have a flexible, adaptable, agile regulatory system that can keep pace with modern innovation. Thanks so much for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. I want to move to introduce our next witness, Dr. Kara O'Neill. Dr. O'Neill is the co-founder and chief science officer at the Cure San Filippo, the Cure San Filippo Foundation, dedicated to accelerating scientific development on disease and empowering families with the resources they need to navigate their journey. Dr. O'Neill founded the foundation after receiving her daughter, Eliza San Filippo's diagnosis in 2013. At the foundation, Dr. O'Neill leads patient-focused research efforts and awareness, working to bridge the gap between scientists, clinicians, industry, and family. She was awarded the International 2020 Patient Advocacy Leader Award by World Symposium for her exceptional contributions. You may begin your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gillibrand, and members of the committee. On behalf of 15 million children with rare diseases in this country, I thank you truly for your concern. I'm Kara O'Neill, Chief Science Officer at Cure San Filippo Foundation, a pediatrician, and mom to Eliza, who has an ultra-rare genetic disease called San Filippo syndrome, or MPS III, one of many forms of childhood dementia leading to progressive, irreversible brain damage. I'd like to first acknowledge the critical public service, the FDA and its staff, who shoulder complex and heavy workloads every day. We know the pressures are significant because we feel it too. Of late, we've seen many press releases highlighting new FDA policies and programs, which encourage us to look out into the future with hope. But today, the committee has called us here with the recognition that current regulatory barriers are significantly impacting patients right now, and never more starkly than for degenerative conditions where time is the most crucial factor, and where every regulatory flexibility must be leveraged to meet this uniquely urgent need. We can see this illustrated in a story of 3 girls with the same deadly disease, but very different lives. Isabel, or Izzy, was the first child with San Filippo that my husband and I met after our own daughter Eliza's diagnosis. Izzy was just 11, and the disease had already taken a tremendous toll. She could no longer walk independently, taking only a few steps if her mom held most of her weight. Izzy had lost the ability to speak years before and could no longer eat or drink without choking, so relied on a feeding tube. She had seizures and increasingly severe abnormal movements that twisted her arms and legs into painful positions. And during one visit, Izzy's mom shared that she'd come to accept this disease would take her daughter's life. But what she said next has always stuck with me. She said, "In truth, I fear her suffering more than I fear her death." At that time, my Eliza was close to 4 and in an extremely hyperactive stage of the disease. But she sang and talked with us. She played dress up and clopped around the house in my high heels. She rode her tricycle everywhere. She looked so healthy. But what was going on inside her body and brain was a much different picture. Meeting Izzy put us face to face with Eliza's future, the concrete and cruel reality of what this disease would do. A medicine didn't come in time for Izzy. She suffered greatly and passed away just a few weeks before her 15th birthday. For decades, we've known the cause of this disease. We can precisely measure the levels of toxic biomarker to determine whether a treatment's working. And now we have the science to treat it. Thanks to NIH funding and support from nonprofit foundations, including our own, a promising gene therapy was developed and propelled towards clinical trial at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Ohio. While we anxiously were awaiting news the trial would begin, back at home we watched Eliza's sentences becoming shorter, her words less frequent. She became agitated and hardly slept. The disease was taking hold. 2 years later, in May 2016, the clinical trial finally began. And Eliza, then 6.5, was so very lucky to be the first child to receive that gene therapy. It was her chance at a life different from Izzy's, a chance to grow up. Now at 16, it's clear the therapy changed her life. She surpassed average life expectancy, runs on the beach, plays in the water, uses picture cards to tell us how she's feeling and what show she wants to watch on TV. She can feed herself and goes to school every day. These are simple but incredibly meaningful abilities that have a huge impact on her daily life. And children treated with higher doses earlier in life have even more remarkable outcomes. Like Caroline, who's now 10, she can read, play on a softball team, and learn to ski on her recent family vacation. But despite these breakthroughs, and nearly 10 years after the trial began, families outside the trial are still waiting for access. Why? Because last summer the drug was denied approval, not because of safety or how the children were benefiting, but for questions about manufacturing. And while this is an important issue, FDA could have used its flexibility to continue reviewing the application while addressing questions in parallel. You see, early on, trial data confirmed the drug's mechanism was more than just plausible, it was biologically effective, showing significant reduction of toxic biomarker within just 6 months after treatment in all the children. Granting accelerated approval based on this biomarker would have brought treatment access to children years earlier, preventing further brain damage and changing the lives of so many children, like Sadie, who's here today, who's still waiting. This same drug application was recently resubmitted, but FDA issued another denial asking for yet more paperwork before agreeing to review it again. Congress has given FDA the tools of flexibility it needs to accelerate approvals for these devastating diseases. But sadly, flexibility and speed are not actually what most rare disease patients are witnessing. Transformative therapies are at FDA's doorstep, and so with great respect, families are pleading for FDA to unlock the door and move with urgency so that our children can have a chance at the life they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Campbell, for your testimony. Now we'll go to questions. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I have to commend you for another excellent hearing here. At the start of the hearing, I received a text from Laura McGlynn, who reminds me that 10 years to this day, as Chairman of Homeland Security, I held a hearing titled Connecting Patients to New and Potential Life-Saving Treatments. Her son, Jordan, who suffered from Duchenne muscular dystrophy, testified that hearing, was certainly present there. 2 years later, that resulted in Right to Try, which was not easy to pass. I had to hold up the FDA user fee bill, had to water down Right to Try quite a bit to make sure that Big Pharma wouldn't sabotage it. They did sabotage it over in the House, but because of President Trump's leadership, he forced the House to pass the Senate version. Its main benefit is its name. It's very limited in its application, unfortunately. But people have the right to try. Laura has also begged me in a text to mention adalurin and duramycel, two investigatory drugs that are also being held up by the FDA for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I think we probably are going to need another piece of legislation, probably right to try 2.0, something that's going to be far more effective than the current right to try. But I'll tell you, reading this testimony this morning, you can maybe tell just by my passion, it enraged me. It enraged me that these families, these patients are being denied effective treatments because of the regulatory roadblocks. Quick story, and again, I want to ask questions, but a quick story. After I met the Duchenne muscular dystrophy community, they went up before a panel of FDA. This was probably in 2016, 17, or 18, begging. There are about 60 Duchenne muscular patients' families begging the FDA, please approve this investigatory drug for our children. Again, time is muscle, time is brain. And that panel, I don't know who sat on it, listened to those 60 families begging them and said no. Just like they said no, and I can't even pronounce these diseases and drugs. They say no time and time and time again. That has to change. Congress is directing the FDA, be more flexible, say yes. You know, these patients understand the risks. They ought to have the right to try. Dr. Schmamann, am I pronouncing that right?
Yes, sir.
I don't want you throwing anybody under the bus because I don't want this to impact future approvals. But describe your meetings with CEDAR. And to me, it's shocking to have one of those members of that panel say, why should we listen to you? Well, because you're a doctor at Harvard, you're treating patients, you're having success, you're giving them a new lease on life, and you've got bureaucrats inside these agencies saying, why the hell should we listen to you? So I want you going into greater detail, describe what those meetings are like.
Thank you, Senator. We've heard a few words a few times. Heartbreaking is the experience of patients and families going through this, and the compassion that is required. I saw none of that in the 3 meetings with the FDA. The members of the panel were like talking to a brick wall. There was no engagement, no dialogue. In fact, they said as much. This is not a dialogue. This is not a collaboration. They did not seem to see the suffering of the patients, and they didn't hear the science. They were rigid and inflexible and unyielding. The FDA worked with the company initially, but then they changed their mind later. And so as the studies unfolded, everything came to a grinding halt. This drug in particular is safe. It metabolizes into a drug that's been there for 30 years in the market and is safe. Patients say it works. The doctors say it works. The study shows it works. The double-blind first study showed it worked. The real-world evidence shows it works. Patients behind me, every one of them, talking to them yesterday, say it works. This drug works. What, to paraphrase Senate, what is their problem? And my experience of the people on that panel 3 times as a private citizen coming for the first time to the FDA was deeply distressing.
So I've already texted Dr. Tracy Beth Hogue, told her I've read your testimony. I'll be sending her your testimony. I hope she listens to this. And if I could just take a couple more minutes, Dr. O'Neill, you are obviously personally impacted by this. Can you describe any meetings you've had, similar to what we just heard? So again, the American people need to understand what these regulators are doing and not doing. Dr. O'Neill.
Thank you. I will say that My interactions with regulators have been kind. So maybe a bit of a different perspective is they have listened, they have been interested to hear what we had to say, to hear the patient perspective. And I think where we're challenged is that we don't see that translated into regulatory action. And some of the decisions that are coming out are not benefiting patients right now. So listening is great, but two-way conversation and collaboration is actually what's needed, and greater transparency in how patient experience data and patient input is actually being integrated into these decisions.
So my guess is that panel with Duchenne muscular dystrophy back in 2017, whatever, probably listened very nicely to the families, but they still said, no, that's an unacceptable answer. Again, you have my commitment. I'm going to delve into this. We're going to right these wrongs. But Mr. Chairman, this is, again, an excellent hearing. We've got to follow up on this. This is just completely unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Elsa Brooks.
Thank you so much, Chair Scott, also Ranking Member Gillibrand. And I'm so grateful to be here today, joined by so many patient advocates, caregivers, family members. I've heard from many Marylanders living with rare diseases and from their families, including dozens who have visited my office this week to share their priorities and their concerns. As I underscored with the NIH director a few weeks ago, patients suffering from devastating diseases do not have time to wait for needless delays to critical cures. For Marylanders with rare diseases, delayed access is not just an inconvenience, it is a matter of life or death. For many with rare conditions, clinical trials are their last and best hope. These patients also depend on a regulatory process that is science-driven and capable of turning research into real treatment. Instead of strengthening those foundations, this administration is constantly disrupting clinical trials, slowing innovation, and undermining the pipeline to cures. Scientific integrity should always guide decision-making, and we must protect the firewall between the Food and Drug Administration and political influence. President Trump and Secretary Kennedy continue to decimate critical parts of that system. The instability they've caused ripples across families, physicians, researchers, and innovators, and patients pay the price. So, Ms. Kennedy, I'd like to ask, over the past 2 weeks, we saw a striking example of political interference at the FDA involving a seasonal mRNA flu vaccine from Moderna. The agency first declined even to review the application, then reversed course just 1 week later after a revised regulatory approach. The abrupt change raised serious concerns about transparency, predictability, and political influence in what should be a scientific process, an episode many have described as regulatory whiplash. What does that kind of volatility signal about how the FDA is functioning right now, and why does that matter for rare disease reviews that depend on regulatory consistency?
So, first of all, thank you so much, Senator, for being here and for all of you being here today and for this important issue. I think first it's important to say that I'm not an expert in vaccines, and I'm here really to focus on rare disease, but I appreciate the question really asking about the trends that we're seeing and us being here really trying to follow the trends and understand what that means for rare disease. I also agree with Dr. O'Neill that we have seen real intention from career staff and staff scientists at FDA around their engagement, but what we're concerned about is, to your question, what seems to be reversals in decisions where there had been previous agreement, previous work with sponsors that was directing sponsors to move in one direction, and then regulatory decisions seem to be yielding different decisions at this point. So as I stated in my testimony, we have seen recently 23 complete response letters issued in rare diseases that are delaying access to the patient community and having devastating consequences to our community. Many of those actually are decisions that are reversals in regulatory agreements that had been made previously. Additionally, we're very concerned that previously, if there were to be a complex decision that needed to be worked through between a sponsor and the agency, an advisory committee would have been convened. And we have seen 65% fewer advisory committees convened in 2025 than 2024, and in fact, none since July. So we're very concerned that the regulatory tools that are at the disposal of the agency to really work through some of these really complex decisions aren't being utilized.
Thank you. And just very quickly, if I can also go to Ms. O'Neill, finding new cures doesn't happen overnight, and it rarely happens in a single year. Breakthrough therapies are built over decades of careful scientific work, and discoveries in NIH-funded laboratories form the foundation for treatments that later move into clinical trials through regulatory review and ultimately into patient care. So when NIH research capacity is disrupted, as we have seen, and weakened, how does that set back the search for new cures long before therapies ever reach the FDA?
Thank you for your question. The NIH is a critical source of funding for innovation in this country and scientific innovation. It's interesting that when there were disruptions and uncertainty in the funding, we received a flood of requests about funding from our small nonprofit foundation. And I think nonprofit foundations across the country were seeing that, and we're not equipped to take up all of the preclinical and transformative science that NIH can do. So the role of the NIH in supporting innovation is huge.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to you and the ranking member for convening this, and thank you all so much for being here today to help bring some of these critical issues to Americans and Pennsylvanians to light. Ms. Kennedy, more than 30 million Americans live with rare diseases, yet fewer than 5% have an approved treatment. Since, as you mentioned, since early 2025, the FDA has issued at least 23 complete response letters for rare disease therapies, while advisory committees' use has declined dramatically. So when late-stage rare disease applications raise concerns, what alternatives to issuing a complete response letter should the FDA use, including advisory committees or structured post-approval commitments, to resolve issues without restarting the entire process?
Thank you. We appreciate that question. So FDA has it at its disposal, thanks to Congress, many types of engagements between sponsors and the agency. Many of those have been made possible thanks to the user fees. And we're concerned that many of those meetings and meeting types aren't occurring, and that the CRLs are being utilized as a way to perhaps maybe even clear the docket or create delays. There could be a lot of reasons why that might be happening, but there are meeting types that have been implemented that could enable engagement to answer questions that sponsors and the agency might have. We saw actually the agency deploy this during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, where we saw real rapid, real-time resolution to a crisis in our country, and the agency was able to interact with sponsors, get questions answered in real time, and then we saw that CBER tried to operationalize that in other places and spaces. We would really, as a rare disease community, like to see that operationalized within rare disease, because we believe that our rare disease community has the urgency and unmet need that matches that of a pandemic, of a crisis.
Yeah.
We have individuals in this room who have very limited life expectancies. And if we don't address what's happening in rare disease with that same sense of urgency, they would not be here with us if we were to convene this hearing another year from now.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for highlighting that urgency, and I think we feel it, and you're helping us to feel it, so thank you for that. Mr. Campo, just on the issue of accelerating the process, I was taken by the fact in preparing for this that some countries are moving much faster on rare disease therapies. The European Union's FAST EU program caps multinational clinical trial authorization at 70 days, and Australia allows many trials to begin almost immediately after an ethics approval. So what's going on here? What will happen if the United States fails to keep pace, and what policy changes should we consider in the Congress given what appears to be a much more streamlined approach in other places?
Thank you, Senator. Completely agree. I think, the United States has been the beacon of biotechnology innovation for so many decades, and it's part of why we have more therapies approved today for rare diseases than we did, decades ago. And I would acknowledge legislation like the Orphan Drug Act that led to that. But as we said in our testimony and many of the panelists here today, we've now stopped keeping pace with innovation. And I think one exact point, which I raised in my testimony as well, is speed to clinical trials. And for me, on the one hand, it is time for patience, and taking weeks, 70 days would be a remarkable number. And I think Congress could work with the FDA to pass legislation to encourage, again, centralized IRBs, leveraging digital technology and artificial intelligence to help us do that, reducing regulatory requirements. For sure, those things could speed us into the clinic. The other piece, I think, which is sitting behind this is our national competitiveness and, in some ways, our national security. And when we think about Australia, we think about Europe, collaborative nations, et cetera. There are other nations out there that perhaps we see in a different way. And from my perspective, whether you think of that as a security threat or whether you think of that as a threat to getting drugs to patients, in either case, I think Congress can take a leadership role in helping the FDA to speed through that process.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Senator McCormick. Senator Kim.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Thank you to all of you coming out here. A couple words I just heard that I think really just hit the nail on the head. I love your reactions to it. When we're talking about all the different problems that we're facing with the FDA, the bureaucracy or the workforce issues, I think the word that really hits it home is urgency. And I heard you use that. I heard you use that, Ms. Kennedy. I feel like that's really what we're talking about here is like we need a government that is moving at the speed of urgency that the parents are trying to save their kids, right? Like that we're struggling to understand what the actual purpose here is and the speed with which we need to move. And look, I got two boys. I got an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old. I would do anything for them. And I just like, how do we translate that into the urgency of a government trying to be responsive? And I think that's where some of the disconnect hits on so many levels. Mr. Campbell, you talked about it, used the word national security. I used to work in national security. I was in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere. I saw this government move with urgency when they felt like lives were on the line. But why is it that we can't necessarily translate that to another circumstance where there are millions of lives on the line and people just don't have the time to wait for this? And so I think that that's really a purpose. How do we talk about this as a national security priority? It's the same reason we're trying to save lives abroad. It's the same reason we're trying to save lives here at home. Does that make sense to you, Ms. Kennedy? Am I kind of grasping the crux here of what we're trying to push for?
Yes, Senator, you absolutely are. And Congress has recognized this urgency in statute and has enabled the use of regulatory flexibilities, and that is what's reflected in the accelerated approval pathway and the use of surrogate outcome measures and biomarkers in clinical trial design in rare disease. What we're concerned about is that in many of these complete response letters, what we're seeing reflected is FDA, especially in one of the medical product centers, CBER, seems to be the trend that we're detecting backing away from a comfort level or use of the surrogate biomarkers. But what we've seen in rare disease is surrogates work. Surrogate biomarkers do save lives. We have more than 250 products that have been approved through the accelerated approval pathway, but fewer than 20% of those are for the non-oncologic, non-infectious disease, rare diseases, which means there is a distinction between what's happening in the rare community that's in this room and the broader rare community. So it's really important when we look at those statistics that we sort of look at what the different medical product centers are comfortable with and are doing. And that's why we know that the tools are available. We want to ensure that they're being utilized.
Mr. Campbell, I want to bring you in on this because you've talked about this at length. Build off of what we just heard. How would an expanded use of adaptive trial designs or surrogate endpoints by the FDA lend itself to achieving better outcomes when it comes to rare disease approvals?
Yeah, I think the first step is just use what we have available to us, right? So if you look at oncology, I think in 2024, there are 8,000 different therapeutics in clinical trial design. That dwarfs the number in rare diseases today. And I think a large part of that is the much more welcoming use of accelerated approval and surrogate biomarkers. Our own product, Galafold, was approved on a surrogate biomarker. The competitor product, also Fabrazyme, was approved on a surrogate biomarker, and these things work. I get it. Rare diseases are biologically complex. It's very difficult to understand how long it's going to take. You can't do randomized control studies in the same way you can with broader disease populations. But when it's done right, as in the case of Fabrazyme, 10 years later, after using real-world evidence and a registry, they were able to confirm the original surrogate endpoint, and now it's a fully approved product. So for me, the tools are all there. It's really more, as we've discussed, consistency and using the tools that exist. If we were to, please. Go
I
ahead.
just want to
Senator.
jump in here at the end. I mean, the urgency on the trials and moving up forward on the approvals. But Mr. Campbell, I also want to raise another issue, which is just how long it often takes to build manufacturing facilities here in the United States. The level of slowness with the inspections themselves. So I want that urgency on the manufacturing side as well. What can you be showing us about the decision makings that manufacturers are going through, especially in terms of being able to build this and manufacture this here in America?
Here at home. Thank you so much for the opportunity to address that. So just by background, and because we work with external manufacturers, as a small cap company, we don't have the capital to build our own manufacturing facilities, and we certainly don't have an environment to be able to do that. So we work outside the United States. It takes 3 to 5 years to build a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility for protein therapeutics. It takes another 1 to 2 years then to get that facility inspected. So you're talking 5 to 7 years from we want to do this to when it actually has medicine coming off the line for patients. So in my mind, it's mutually beneficial to all of us. So create incentives, and they don't have to be financial incentives. Help with permitting, help with inspections, give priority to inspections for homegrown manufacturing facilities, create an environment that's actually supportive of bringing manufacturing at home versus using, which is what we've seen over the last couple of years, more sticks to try to prevent, probably a more qualified person to speak to this, speaking in background, but so let's use incentives instead of sticks to encourage that, because I think the United States ecosystem, the patients, all benefit from doing that.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, we've talked at length here in this committee about the benefits on so many levels of having that manufacturing here in America, the speed with which we can move, the capabilities. These are some very concrete things that I hope we can follow up on and really come up with a game plan here, because it's just, honestly, it's just pathetic that we're just not able to do this with a greater level of speed, given the skills and the talent and the resources of our country. We can and should be doing better. So thank you for holding this hearing today.
Thank you, Senator Kim. Senator Johnson, do you have some more questions?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, I think the elephant in the room here is, so we've got the laws in place. There maybe could be beefed up, but I think it's a personnel issue, right? I fear that not even necessarily the heads of the agencies, but possibly bureaucrats that have been there for decades, for whatever reason, they don't like a particular drug, and so they are able to sabotage it. My question, how can we overcome the inconsistency from one bureaucrat to the next bureaucrat, changing administrations, or quite honestly, a particular bureaucrat that's been in there for decades that just keeps blocking things? How do you get to the personnel issue? And I'll start with you, Ms. Kennedy.
So I think my experience differs from some on this panel in that we have seen great examples of models where we've had public meetings and public workshops where FDA has come together with the patient community, which I think is an incredibly important mechanism to have meetings where we can have regulatory agreement around the use of certain innovative models in clinical trial design, surrogate endpoints, natural history studies as a control arm that had then allowed those programs to move forward.
I pointed out in a meeting like that, a panel for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, 50 to 60 families, and they still said no.
So I love that reference. What you may not know, you probably don't know, is prior to being with the Every Life Foundation, I was with the Duchenne community, and so that may have been an advisory
Were you
committee
in
meeting.
that? Were you in that
Yes,
meeting?
I was. Well, it depends what meeting you're referring to. If it was an AdCom, an advisory committee meeting, that advisory committee did vote no. But then the agency brought that internally and then overruled that. But that's a perfect example of the agency still has the authority to make the decision because they heard from the community. And what we're concerned about right now is that the agency isn't engaging with the patient community.
So, Dr. Neal, in your testimony, you talked about you got your CO, the complete response letter. I mean, perfect bureaucratic type of, in other words, the no letter, right? And you got the no letter, not necessarily because of safety or lack of efficacy, it's because there's something in the manufacturing process, which again, I'm a manufacturer, I understand that, but can you explain that? It seems like a pretty weak excuse where you could, well, fix the manufacturing process so this drug can be made available. Just talk about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I am not an expert on gene therapy manufacturing, so I will say that. However, the sponsor was very transparent in reviewing the full CRL with our community so that we could understand truly what the concerns were. Many of them were noted to be things like a crack on the floor, not in the manufacturing area, or a tarp that was out back, or things that really are unrelated to our children.
Trust me, I've been through audits. I supplied packaging material for medical devices. You can find an excuse to, write something up, pretty flimsy excuses. And again, that's my concern. Dr. Schmamann, in your case, it was based on real world evidence. It seems like the real world evidence was completely in favor of allowing patients access to this drug. Talk a little bit about why you got a CLR, a no letter.
Thank you, Senator. One of the thoughts that came to me as we were going through this whole process and hearing what happened to San Felipe with the crack in the floor in the factory is that this is a policy of death by technicality. These little tiny glitches that the FDA is producing land up not approving drugs, and patients die as a consequence. I'm glad to hear that there are people in the FDA who are doing what Congress requires them to do, but that speaks to the unpredictability and the erratic nature of the responses and the performance of the people in the FDA. There are many ways to go forwards to use clinical trials and then use the new technology to bring treatments to patients faster that are safe and make a difference. Science advances. The regulation is keeping up with the new advances, but it seems like the FDA is having trouble with that. So the FDA must keep pace with the updates in science, using the biomarkers, your serum or imaging, using digital markers, using patient-reported outcomes. I developed a patient-reported outcome measure for ataxia, understanding what patients are saying. The key issue here is that the real experts are the patients. The patients are the experts by experience. The patients are our research collaborators. We are all patients. Every one of us has something. We're all patients. It may not be a rare disease, but it applies to us. We're talking about us, whether it's a rare disease or not. And so the approach that can be taken, including what was started at our institution, I think called a platform trial, where you can have one small group of controls and a number of other patient cohorts trying different drugs. There are innovations both in the clinical trial design and the biomarker space, but this is where we need to move, and the urgency is exactly what Senator Kim was talking about. There is an urgency now, in some of the drugs on the table now, the ones you've heard about from Dr. O'Neill and myself, these should be approved this week. There's no reason not to, and going forwards, we need to find a way to enhance, to expedite, and make this a better process, and have a sense that when you're going to the FDA, you know what you're getting. It's not just a random scatter plot of who's going to get what kind of a person there.
But isn't another root cause here is literally the doctors are no longer at the top of the treatment pyramid? They've been replaced by regulators. I mean, you talk patients are number one, but doctors are the ones that are most knowledgeable in this equation, and you're shunning off to the side. What you're saying doesn't count, because the regulators have replaced you in terms of making these decisions for patients. Isn't that a big problem?
You know, Senator, on your wall in your office yesterday, I saw your mission statement, which was triple: teamwork, respect, integrity, professionalism, loyalty, and education. The FDA is not doing that. It's the opposite. Communication, dialogue, teamwork between the physicians, the patients, the pharma who make the drug, the regulators. That's a two-way street. It's a dialogue. In medicine, when we do rounds in the morning on our patients in the hospital, there's a discussion. The physician's there, the residents are there, the nurse practitioner, the physical therapist, the patient and the family. It's a conversation, a discussion. This is not what we're hearing from across the board, and certainly from the other rare diseases. And we're here, it's a few of us. Turns out there are 30 million people behind us, as you said. And so what we're bringing to you is the plea to make the FDA what it was supposed to be, which is what you regulated, and allow us to work in a collaborative manner across the board, not with this kind of hit or miss approach as to who you're going to get on a committee. You're looking for accountability, and in fact, the leadership of the FDA is their responsibility to hold the feet to the fire of the people under that person's leadership, not just to say good things, but to actually make them happen and bring new drugs to the American population, including us, our patients, my patients, that are safe and effective.
Well, again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is excellent hearing, excellent testimony. Both you and the ranking member, you pretty well diagnosed the problem here. I mean, in your opening statements, you laid out the problems. This is eminently fixable, and we have to fix it. So again, I'm committed to working with you to do so. But thank you for this hearing.
Thank you. In 1972, the Federal Advisory Committee Act established advisory committees within the FDA to help provide independent expert scientific input on product reviews and policy topics. In 2025, FDA canceled many advisory committee meetings and indicated that it would like to move away from involving advisory committees in the review of drug applications. For each of the witnesses, you can start, Ms. Kennedy. How important is it to the rare disease community for FDA to restore the use of advisory committees?
It's everything. We yesterday had one of our communities showcase in front of close to 800 members of the rare disease community how an advisory committee meeting helped inform a key regulatory decision for the Barr syndrome community by showing how an open public hearing enabled members of that community illuminate the nuance of a very complex regulatory decision in a very complicated regulatory review. As Senator Johnson just highlighted, I've been a part of many advisory committee meetings for communities, including the Duchenne community. And advisory committees don't always vote yes. That's not the point. But the point is for external experts, including clinicians, including those with statistical expertise and manufacturing expertise that are not always internal to the agency, to be brought to bear on regulatory decisions, because we realize that with 10,000 rare diseases, it is not possible for FDA to always have all of that expertise internal. Those committee hearings must be at the avail of the agency, but also those open public hearings must be available so that patient communities who are participating in clinical trials can share what their experiences in those clinical trials are. One of the challenges we have in clinical trial design is we don't always know what we're going to find when a clinical trial begins. We design a clinical trial hoping that we are going to be able to select the best outcome measures. But sometimes patient communities who participate in those trials experience other benefits. And those hearings enable us to hear from patients about what other outcomes were achieved so that we can make the best decisions possible for the patient community around safety and efficacy. Eliminating those hearings eliminates the chance for FDA to make the decisions that are in the best interests of the patient communities possible.
And Dr. Schmahmann, and Dr. O'Neill, congressional actions have advanced how patient experience data is included in the development and evaluation of rare disease therapies. What is the importance of the patient voice in this regulatory process, and what more is needed to ensure FDA includes this information in its decision-making?
I agree that it is critical, Senator. I think that there's a deeper problem. If you don't listen to somebody else's advice in a complex story, that is the opposite of humility. It is a denial of the patient's humanity. And it's sort of hubris. You don't want to hear what the patients have to say? Who are you? And that's the problem. This is all about the patients. To deny the patient voice in drug development and in drug design, and I agree completely with Ms. Kennedy here, that determining the end point when you start is fine if the disease is well known in the millions of people. But in our case, for example, in spinocerebellar ataxia, the first clinical trials that Biohaven did in the 2016s, we didn't know what would change. We had to take a guess, and I worked with them in devising the scale, devising the trial. The patients then told us, you know what, I'm falling less, I'm not as fatigued, and my speech is better. So that was a different outcome we didn't understand at the beginning. That is the epitome of regulatory flexibility. And there's a rule in medicine. Listen to the patient, they're telling you the answer. And the second piece is ignore the patients at your peril. What we have here is denying of the patient's story. It is the peril not of us, but of the patient, because now the drugs are not being approved. And I think you've hit the nail on the head here. If you're ignoring the patient, then why are you getting up in the morning and coming to do the work that you do with the FDA?
Well said. Dr. O'Neill.
Thank you. You know, obviously you've heard that patients are not outside of the drug development process. They are critical to it. And advisory committees, as Annie had mentioned, are an important place where we can have that scientific dialogue and hear from patients. And their experience is also science. It is human science. But the interaction needs to come way before that, because by the time we get to an advisory board, tens of millions of dollars have been spent, maybe a decade has gone by, we have not treated potentially that many patients who needed treatment. So having a true collaborative dialogue early in the process is essential and an opportunity that needs to be acted upon within the FDA. I think one other thing that we're understanding is key insights around risk tolerance. We also want safe medicines, but we also want the opportunity to save our children, because those answers about a clinical trial come way down the road. And as Mr. Campbell explained, real-world evidence, post-marketing disease monitoring programs, this is where we need to be really focusing on these innovative ways, maybe not so innovative, honestly, anymore, but more frequently used and supported ways to provide that longer-term evidence to support accelerated approval.
Mr. Campbell, did you want to add?
For sure. I think what we keep coming back to, and I think you hear the theme, is you have all the tools in place. You have the advisory committees, you have accelerated approval pathways, and I think the frustration is when they're deployed inconsistently and without clarity from the sponsors and from the patient community and from the physicians in terms of how you ended up, meeting the expectation, but then not coming to a positive resolution. There's one other piece that we haven't talked about, if I could just introduce that, which is the Rare Disease Innovation Hub. So if we want to talk about things that Congress could proactively do, we have a tool that's modeled after what was very successful in oncology, the Center of Excellence. But my observation would be is it's underfunded and probably underempowered to do what it needs to do. So when we think about advisory committees, when we think about staffing at the FDA, when we think about consistency between reviewers, Congress could directly fund the Rare Disease Innovation Hub in a meaningful way that would allow us to train rare disease experts that could sit across review teams, across review divisions, and bring some of that consistency, that humanity, that humility, but that expertise that perhaps each of the individual teams or the new reviewer on the team doesn't quite have. So again, I think we have a lot of the tools that we need. We just need to encourage the FDA to use them in the right way. And that's one example we haven't talked about here today, where Congress could fund that directly and allow the FDA to make it a much more valuable tool for.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
When you hear the testimony, I think all of us internalize it. I've got 6 grandsons and a granddaughter, And, thank God they don't, everybody's got problems, right? But, they don't have a rare disease that's going to shorten their life. And so I can't imagine what a family's going through when they have a family member that has something and then they believe there's a possibility that something could change their life and it doesn't happen. I would be pretty frustrated. So, and I'd be pretty more than that. So, Ms. Kennedy, it's important for people to come to Congress and talk about their concerns with regard to the drug approval process.
Well, I know you're asking me, but there are about 800 people on the Hill that would be happy to answer that question as well. Throughout this time here this morning, starting with your opening remarks, we have cited many laws that have been transformational for a rare disease community, and every single one of them started with a member of the community meeting with their elected official and talking about a roadblock that could be transformed and turn into a resource and a tool. And every single one of those laws has transformed lives and ultimately has saved lives. So the answer to your question is an emphatic yes, and we are so grateful for the time you take to meet with our community, to listen to our community, to engage, and to become partners with all of us. So thank you.
Does the FDA appreciate when you guys come here?
I think many do, yes. Maybe some no. But I think overall, over the years, I've been in this space 30 years, and I think we've had strong partnerships with the agency, and many times the agency has very much appreciated our support.
Dr. Schwalman, from a clinical standpoint, what happens to patients with progressive neurologic diseases when access to treatment is delayed due to the regulatory process rather than safety concerns?
They progressively deteriorate, they lose function, they can't live their lives, go to work, spend time with their family, make a living, be productive citizens of society in that way. They become part of the family that people have to take care of instead of taking care of the family themselves. And then they become progressively debilitated, and then they die young. And then family members, in our case, see that. They see their future in the mirror. There's a high incidence of depression and, in fact, suicidality in this patient community as well. And this is across the spectrum. So this is not a motor control problem alone. This is a social, emotional, societal issue. And the issue about medications that improve neurological function in real time work at the level of the physiology where brain cells are sick before they die. And so if you have a medication, even though it's not a gene therapy, you have a medication like troriluzole where we know the mechanism, and you stop the neurons from being so hyperactive that they die, you actually improve function and you slow disease over time, so you're modifying the disease. So the absence of a medication that can treat the disease means that each day that this drug, troriluzole, and others like it, are not being approved means patients are losing brain cells and are closer to death. It is heartbreaking to see, as you all said at the outset, and we're hoping that this can change from today.
I think in your testimony you said that the FDA suggested withdrawing patients from compassionate use care to evaluate whether their conditions would deteriorate, despite physicians expressing the harm would be irreversible. So tell me about what are the ethical implications of that?
So if you have a disease where there's a symptom like a migraine, for example, you can see if I stop the drug, will you get worse for a week or two or a month, and I'll put you back on drug, you're okay. In a neurodegenerative disease like these, and I'm going to be, excuse me if I'm provocative, the last time we had a catastrophe in medical science in the US was between 1922 and 72, I believe. There was like a 40-year period, 32 to 72, when people with syphilis were not treated so that the doctors could see what happened to them, and the patients were not told. That is a case study for every person who is going into human studies research in the United States. We learn about that case. You cannot treat patients like guinea pigs. You have to have them on your story as part of the research collaborator, experts by experience. if we have a drug, as we do here, that is firstly safe and that bends the arc of the disease, and you want patients to come off that drug so you can see if they worsen, in other words, if their brain cells are dying under your care, that is a poster child. It's Tuskegee version 2, and it is entirely unacceptable. I reject it outright. They should not have recommended that, and whoever did, I would suggest they take updated education sessions on clinical trials and on human studies research. It is not okay, Senator.
I can't imagine doing that. Mr. Campbell, talk about inconsistent FDA standards, how it impacts timelines, costs, ability of small biotech companies to survive. Is it easy to raise money if the FDA is inconsistent? Does that make your job easier?
No, is the candid answer. And, that's underlying all of this, right? So we have created in the United States this rich ecosystem of innovation, which has been supported by Congress, supported by FDA over the years, supported by modern technology. And that brings in new companies that bring in new innovations and offer some of the therapies that we've talked about here today that are now stuck in front of this regulatory process. The reality is, and this is in my written testimony, the reality is for many small and mid-sized biotech companies, it takes decades to become profitable, which means we are going hand in mouth, begging for dollars from investors. If there is a clear path forward and investors can be confident of an eventual return, then they will keep investing and the innovation ecosystem keeps going and going. If we continue to create this uncertainty, if we continue to create an uncertainty around manufacturing timelines, around approval timelines, around changing the goalposts at the end, I am confident that those investor dollars will go somewhere else. And I'll tell you transparently, having gone to the recent JP Morgan Healthcare Conference, which I'm sure folks know is the big investor conference in our industry, I heard more opportunities about Chinese therapeutics and companies than ever before, and I don't think that's an accident. 10, 20 years ago, we might have thought the science wasn't good. We might have distrusted the quality and the safety. I can tell you that the innovation there and the science is equally as good as ours. We still have an advantage, but if we're not careful, we're going to lose that advantage, and at the end of the day, the American patients suffer, the American economy suffers, and I'm convinced that's a real threat in addition to the most important piece, which is making sure drugs get to patients faster.
Dr. O'Neill, in progressive rare diseases, how should regulators account for the fact that clinical decline is often irreversible? Should the harm of waiting be weighed alongside uncertainty in the data, and if so, how?
Thank you. Yes, to call back to Dr. Shamaman's points around this and about exposure to not being on drug, the risks of not treating this disease are known. These are not in question. We know these children will be permanently, severely brain injured for the rest of their lives. And there are critical, time-sensitive neurodevelopmental windows in childhood when it is important to intervene to be able to receive the maximum benefit. And there's a continuum of this, but earlier is always better. And what we are still hearing as recommended to sponsors is that observational or no treatment or placebo-controlled trials are being recommended for these pediatric conditions. This is very, very troubling when we know that they will become brain injured. We have also seen, when parents ask me about this, I have to kind of step back and think, oh my goodness, I know what a perfect science experiment looks like. Yes, that's the perfect science experiment, but these are children. You cannot do good medicine unless you're putting the patients first and following the ethics of medicine. And we have heard changes around the use of animals in preclinical studies. Just last April, the FDA published its roadmap to reducing animal testing in preclinical studies. And this says, I quote, "Due to the limitations of animal testing, as well as ethical concerns about animal testing, there have been increased focus within the scientific community on new approach methodologies. We are concerned about the ethics of animal testing more than we are concerned about the ethics of allowing children to be brain injured in clinical trials." And I think we all need a gut check on that.
Would any of you like to talk about what patients and caregivers tell you about their willingness to accept uncertainty or incomplete data when the alternative is no treatment at all?
I think that starts off with safety. Nobody likes side effects, and patients do want to know that the medications are safe or the approaches are safe. Given that, that piece, if we can make a comment about safety, the degree to which the medication works or not is often something that patients, I think, are willing to take on, and then we can certainly hear from the others about that in the other rare diseases. But in our space, knowing that the medications we have available are safe and have been shown in other circumstances, patients are not just willing, we're getting emails every day from people around the world. What trials do you have for me that I can use to try and slow down the process of my disease?
Okay.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And I think my response would be that for each subpopulation, within each condition, within each targeted therapy, that consideration would be very different, which is why Congress authorized the use of the benefit-risk framework within the consideration of regulatory review. And that is one of the things that we are concerned is not being applied, and we don't know how it's being used. So one of the things that we're asking for today is more questioning around how are these tools being utilized, because every community for every clinical trial within every subpopulation of that community will approach that threshold for risk tolerance differently. And that's a super important question, Senator, and we're just not sure that that's being questioned the way it was intended for the tailorization that's required for rare disease therapeutic development.
Yeah. Ms. Campbell, can I ask you a separate question? How important is transparency from the FDA in maintaining trust with rare disease communities? And what happens when explanations for delay are unclear or incomplete?
You know, I feel like as sponsors, manufacturers, we have a great duty to our patients. And I think one of the senators asked me why I'm in this business. And I'll tell you, it's for the patients. But when you have a chance to develop a therapy for people living with a rare disease, it sort of gets in your blood. But you also, then you bear a great responsibility. And I feel like sponsors are at the front lines in front of the agency trying our best to get those drugs over the finish line. And if we fail to do that for any reason, we owe it to the patients, to the community, to the caregivers to give them an explanation. And when there is no good explanation, or when the explanation is a crack on the floor, that's just not good enough. And I think I really do believe that sponsors bear some of that responsibility. And so I think it works best when we truly work together. Congress has the tools. The FDA has proven itself over time to be very effective in working with sponsors. I shared our story, which was an incredible, innovative regulatory science, medical science that helped thousands of patients. But if you don't have that transparency and if you don't have that consistency, then we all lose. And I really believe that we're at the center of that. And it pains me to hear these stories. We're not in that position today as amicus, but we owe a responsibility to these people who are giving their lives to participate in clinical studies, who have so much hope. We owe them clarity, and we all do, everybody who's involved in that, including the regulators.
Ranking Member Gillibrand, do you want to say anything before we close?
I would like the audience members who have pictures of their loved ones to stand, please, so we can see their loved ones. Thank you for coming to represent them. Thank you all. And I want to just thank our guest who's in the corner, who's been so well behaved this entire time. And I'm very proud of her for being such a good girl. Just thank you all for being here today. This has been an extremely powerful hearing. We've gotten some amazing testimony, and I'm very hopeful that we will find better solutions so that we can all work together to get these cures that our loved ones so desperately need. Thank you all.
So I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank the ranking members for this. We've been doing this for a little over a year, and we've been able to do a lot of things together. So what we heard today was not abstract policy theory. We heard from Mr. Campbell that 95% of rare diseases still have no approved treatment. At the current pace, it could take more than a century to meaningfully close that gap. We heard from Dr. Schwaman about a multi-year data set supported by real-world evidence and natural history comparisons, showing meaningful showing of disease progression, yet still unable to clear the regulatory bar. We heard from Ms. Kennedy that at least 23 rare disease therapies received complete response letters in the past year, even as advisory committees meetings decline, raising concern about whether the flexibility Congress authorized is being applied consistently. Reminded that for some patients, success is not an abstract endpoint, but the ability to hold one breath long enough to survive another moment. I recently spoke with Commissioner Makary. It was clear that the FDA's framework was built for common diseases, not rare ones. It is implementing reforms like the plausible mechanism pathway, greater flexibility for gene therapies, and strengthening the Rare Disease Innovation Hub. We look forward to working with him to ensure those changes are applied consistently and urgently for patients. He inherited a broken system, and the FDA cannot be fixed overnight. That said, he has made significant progress, and I'm completely encouraged by the reforms President Trump has empowered Commissioner Makary to make at the FDA, and I know he cares deeply about getting results and making sure the United States remains the world's leader for innovation and treatment of rare diseases. Taking together the testimony presented before our committee today makes one thing clear. The question is not whether to protect safety, is whether the system is moving with the urgency Congress intended and patients require. The committee will continue exercising oversight to ensure that flexibility enacted into law becomes reality in practice. I look forward to continuing work with our members. If any senator has additional questions for the witnesses or statements to be added, the hearing record will be open until next Wednesday at 5 p.m. Thanks, everybody, for being here.